Bon appetit. I'd bon appetit him. Hello and welcome to my review of Emily in Paris. I thought this soda was a lighter color, so it would look like I was drinking champagne, but it's very clearly just carbonated apple juice, and I did not want to water it down to make it look like champagne, because then it wouldn't taste as good. So, Emily in Paris actually originally released right before I started doing TV shows, but it was already kind of on my radar. I had actually already tried to watch it once before, but it just honestly didn't hook me in during the first episode, so I ended up skipping it. But what brought the show back to my attention was its nomination for 2 Golden Globes, one for a Best Musical and Comedy Series and Best Actress in a Musical and Comedy for lead actress Lily Collins. So now that I review TV shows, and Emily in Paris is pretty in my wheelhouse, with reviewing shows like Bridgerton and Fate the Winx Saga that have a teenage/young adult demographic. And since you guys seem to really like those 2 reviews, I figure I kind of stay in that area. Now first for my spoiler-free review, I could recommend this show as just kind of a casual show to have in the background, or if you are really into what I would call wish fulfillment fantasy, I'll go more into what that is in the spoiler review. But if you're someone who looks really closely into a show's details or needs to have a really engaging, interesting story to enjoy a show, then I wouldn't really recommend it, because the more I think about the show, the more its issues kind of bubble to the surface. So the premise of Emily in Paris is pretty simple. Emily's boss, who is set to take a position at a marketing firm in France, gets pregnant at the last minute, so Emily goes in her stead knowing no French and knowing nothing about French culture. And she goes on this whirlwind trip through Paris. So the first episode opens up with Emily and her boss in Chicago talking about sort of French stereotypes and all these associations they have with France and French people based on stereotypes and assumptions. And so I was like, okay, they're the ugly Americans, they believe all these stereotypes about French people, but then Emily's going to go to France and realize that's not really the case. But as I continue to watch the first episode and as I continue to watch the rest of the first season, I realized, no, this is just the show. There's a particular moment in the first episode where I believe Antoine says, "You have something to learn from us." I thought that was the statement of the show's premise. And I'm not totally against playing off of stereotypes for comedy. While I can't speak to French attitudes towards the stereotypes that Americans tend to give them, I know a lot of Asian American comedy is centered around playing off of stereotypes.
Kumon Learning Centers, for you guys that don't know, are basically detention camps for young Asian children.
But there is a difference between playing off of stereotypes and adhering to stereotypes. A lot of particularly the earlier episodes of the first season are about Emily's co-workers telling her, oh, this is just what French people are like, this is what France is, French people, they just all do this. Well, and also themselves adhering to all the stereotypes they're pushing. And once again, while I cannot speak to the French attitude towards these various stereotypes, like Emily at the beginning of the show, I've actually never even been to France, but I think portraying any group of people as a sort of universal monolith is somewhat dangerous. And just in terms of the show itself, it robs the show of some of the depth it could have, while also making the show very predictable and somewhat repetitive. Speaking of repetitive, particularly the sex jokes and the jokes surrounding how French people talk about sex all the time, how they're always thinking about sex, those get really repetitive, particularly in the final 2 episodes. But even though I found the sex jokes themselves to get kind of repetitive after a while, I honestly didn't mind a lot of the actual romance stories throughout the show, because they're part of what I would call the wish fulfillment fantasy. And I am actually a really big fan of fantasy wish fulfillment stories. It's why I read fan fiction. So things like all of these men constantly flirting with Emily, all of her female friends just being super gosh darn interested in her and wanting to facilitate her love life, or the fact that she even gets this job in the first place even though she's not really qualified for it. Emily saying things to her boss or her co-workers that in the real world would definitely get her fired. Emily's extravagant luxury living despite supposedly coming from a lower to middle class background. All of these are sort of common contrivances, and I would argue even sometimes necessities, of the wish fulfillment fantasy. But I think the problem with the wish fulfillment fantasy formula as it applies to Emily in Paris, while most fantasy wish fulfillment scenarios either encompass around a really generic setting that the audience would be instantly familiar with, Or on the opposite end of the spectrum, a complete fantasy scenario, usually surrounding either a fantasy world or fantasy creatures. But Emily in Paris surrounds Paris and French culture, which is real, but not something a presumed American Netflix watching audience would be in-depthly familiar with. So instead of saying having a mysterious billionaire's business that we really don't need to know all the details about conform to the wish fulfillment fantasy, or a fantasy world where we can just make up all of the rules so that it conforms to the wish fulfillment fantasy, we're having French culture, which is very much a real thing, conform and contort to fit this wish fulfillment fantasy. So that's how we get things like all Frenchmen want to have sex, so all of these Frenchmen can chase Emily and want to have sex with Emily all the time. Everything is in service of the wish fulfillment fantasy and our kind of Mary Sue character at the center of that wish fulfillment fantasy, regardless of whether it is true to French culture or not. Another trope commonly present in particularly white-centric wish fulfillment fantasies is the infinitely more interesting best friend of color. I almost feel like they made Mindy infinitely more interesting on purpose, because honestly, I could tell you way more about Mindy's character than I could ever tell you about Emily. She is a multilingual citizen of the world, former heiress who failed at being a pop star as a child and now works in Paris as a nanny, but still secretly harbors dreams of becoming a singer. And let's see, what can I say about Emily? She's from Chicago. She liked Gossip Girl growing up, and fashion, I guess, by association. She has a boyfriend at the start of the show. She either has 1 or 2 master's degrees. She says at one point in the show that she has a master's in marketing, and then at another point in the show, she says she has a master's in communication. And I don't know if the show means that it's the same degree, but they're using different words, or if she really has 2 master's degrees. I do get that kind of the point of Emily as a character is not to be super interesting or unique. She's kind of our main character, wish fulfillment, self-insert figure. But what I'm saying is, if this were going to be more of kind of a story-driven show and not like a wish fulfillment fantasy, Mindy would have been the main character. Also, her and then Pierre Cadeau, the designer from the later episodes, they have the best jokes. This is definitely going to be a Glenn from The Walking Dead situation for me, in that I will watch season 2 of Emily in Paris just for Mindy. So those are kind of my general overall thoughts about the show. Now I'm kind of just gonna go through some general points that kind of nilled me as I was watching the show. I know I usually give a whole overview and my thoughts of the entire story of a show, and while Emily in Paris definitely does have the skeleton of a story between Emily's struggles with her job and her romance with Gabriel and her trying to juggle that with her friendship with Gabrielle's girlfriend Camille, but I honestly don't really have much to say about either of those plots other than we all knew where that was going. Okay, I am seeing this in editing. Why did I pronounce his name 2 different ways like that? Like, I filmed those 2 segments back to back. I don't know. Feel free to be mad at me, because I am also mad at me. Emily was always gonna keep her job with Savoy, and Gabriel was never going to lose interest in Emily, even if he and Camille stayed together, or Gabrielle ended up moving away. The whole rivalry between Emily and her boss Sylvie was just so trite. I personally have a very big hate against the woman versus woman rivalry, particularly the older woman versus the younger woman, and Sylvie being so antagonistic towards Emily, and it being heavily implied that the reason she's so antagonistic is because she feels threatened by Emily, both in terms of Emily's prowess with social media and then also because of Sylvie's, when it's very clear that 1, it's not Emily's fault that she was put in this position, and then 2, Emily makes it very clear from the beginning that she wants to work with Sylvie and is not out to seize either her job or her relationship. Makes the whole relationship and that whole storyline just so annoying to me personally. I know there are people out there who really love those kind of like catty relationships, but for me personally, I just hate the idea that women will naturally feel threatened towards each other both professionally and romantically, particularly if there's an age gap. It's probably one of my most hated tropes in stories like these. Now, moving on, Emily's whole conflict with her boyfriend back in Chicago just escalates way too quickly. Like I said earlier, I get that everything is in service of the wish fulfillment fantasy, and the show writers probably wanted to get Emily's established boyfriend out of the way so that Emily can gallivant about Paris. But if you were gonna have a boyfriend in the show just for him to break up with her, why not just not have her have a boyfriend? Okay, so there's multiple instances of Emily taking pictures of people in public for her Instagram, Emily in Paris. Again, personal niggle, but I could never do that. I'm currently daily vlogging this whole month of April for Camp NaNoWriMo, and this month that does include a little more footage of me going out on the world since things are starting to open up again. And personally, I don't mind having people in my vlog footage as long as they're like far away enough where you can't really see their faces. But Emily takes some pretty close-up pictures of some people, and I know it's technically a public place and she can do whatever she wants, but God, I could never be that person. Speaking of Instagram, one of the scenes I did actually kind of like in the show was the scene where Emily was attending the influencer event. It's one of the few scenes that really brings Emily down a peg in that while she is one of the best at social media compared to the people at Savoy, there are still a lot of bigger fish in the sea than her. When I say wish fulfillment fantasy, I'm not saying in a sense that I'm talking about a show or a movie where nothing ever goes wrong and the main character is always the best and the one on top, but more so a scenario in which the main character gets to experience things that average people maybe will never experience or will only experience once or twice. Like the idea to move to Paris for a fairly glamorous job is not completely 100% out of the realm of possibility for a lot of people, but it's far enough for most people that it still falls into a possible wish fulfillment fantasy scenario. And I actually think Emily in Paris as a show keeps the wish fulfillment scenario fairly balanced. Emily doesn't succeed all of the time. There's even a few scenes where Emily is just outright embarrassed and she has to pick herself up again, which keeps the scenario more balanced and doesn't completely throw Emily into the Mary Sue category. Well, that's not to say that Emily isn't completely free of the characteristics of the Mary Sue trope, particularly when it comes to her abilities with social media. This isn't unique to Emily in Paris, but a lot of shows treat social media almost like magic. Like if someone is really good with social media, whatever that means, they can make anything happen, they can make anything go viral, it will just happen. Whereas if you've worked in social media in real life, or you even just like me, you just have kind of social media presence, you know that's very much not true. Now I want to talk for a minute about costuming, particularly in terms of Emily. Because I originally wasn't intending to review this show for my channel, I actually have seen some of the discourse surrounding Emily in Paris, and some of that criticism came down to Emily sporting these very obvious brands. I'm not a fashion expert, but I did recognize a few Chanel pieces as well as a pair of Christian Louboutin shoes she was wearing at one point. And while the fashion choices might not be very unique or interesting, I actually feel like her costuming fit very well with her character. As sort of the loud, obvious American who's not afraid to make a statement, it would make sense that she would wear these kind of household name luxury brands with very iconic, easily recognizable logos. I think it makes sense to have her wear these kind of obvious brands with big flashy logos because it fits with her character. It also helps her stand out from the other characters as well. One of my final little thoughts is in the final episode, Emily sleeping with Camille's brother and finding out that he's 17 should not have been as light of a situation as they made it. Again, I know this is France. I also know I'm not super familiar with actual French culture. And I do know there only have been recently some changes to France's age of consent law. But like I said earlier, assuming the show was made for an American Netflix-watching English-speaking audience, this probably should have not been treated as basically a punchline to end the episode on. So yeah, that was my review of Emily in Paris. Let me know, have you watched Emily in Paris? Were you like me and you skipped over it when it first came out, but then came back to it when you found out it was nominated for a few Golden Globes? Let me know, and also let me know what else you would be interested in having me review. And until then, I will see you next time. Hey, I cracked this open for the video. I'm drinking all of it.